The house on Birch Lane stood in the kind of silence that made people speak softer when they walked past. Its brick walls, weathered yet uncracked, rose 3 stories above a neatly clipped lawn. Curtains always drawn, gates always latched. From the street, it looked like the home of people who had nothing to hide and nothing to prove. The kind of place where the smell of baked bread might drift from the windows in winter. But in 1923, when Elias and Marjorie Vane arrived, it began to gather the kind of attention that feels polite on the surface and uneasy underneath. The Vanes were a striking pair for such a small Pennsylvania town. Elias, a tall, soft-spoken man with perfectly combed silver hair despite his 40 years, wore pressed suits even to buy coal. Marjorie, his wife, seemed almost too graceful for the muddy streets, her voice never raised, her smile never strained. They carried themselves with the quiet dignity of people who believe deeply in order, in the way a chair should be pushed in, the way a lock should click shut. No one knew much about where they had come from. No one asked too many questions. It was in the 3rd week of October that they announced, with the kind of warmth people found endearing, that they had adopted a boy from a Catholic orphanage 2 counties away. Samuel, they called him. A healthy, polite 8-year-old with cold, dark eyes and a shy way of standing behind his new father's leg. The town embraced him easily. Orphans often vanished into far colder homes. And here he had his own room, new shoes, books with his name written inside the cover in careful cursive. From the start, Samuel was obedient to a fault. He spoke only when spoken to, ate every bite of food without complaint, and sat perfectly still through church sermons. But as autumn settled into frost, his presence in the Vane household began to ripple outward in small, strange ways. Neighbors noticed lights burning in the east wing of the house until dawn, though Elias and Marjorie insisted Samuel was in bed early. The postman swore he heard muffled thuds beneath the floor when he stepped onto the porch, followed by the quick slide of a latch. One night in the 1st week of December, the sound of Samuel's voice pierced the stillness of Birch Lane. It was a scream so sudden and sharp that 2 neighbors stepped onto their porches in their night clothes. The lights in the Vane home flared, shadows shifting behind the curtains. Minutes later, the front door opened and Elias appeared in his robe, assuring the nearest neighbor that Samuel had simply had a bad dream about falling. But Samuel's face, pale and tear-streaked, could be seen briefly over his shoulder, eyes wide and unblinking as if he was still falling. The next Sunday, Samuel attended the children's Bible class in the church basement. The lesson was on Jacob's ladder, the dream of angels ascending and descending. Halfway through, Samuel froze. His little hands gripped the edge of the table until his knuckles went white. His gaze locked not on the teacher, but on a bare section of the floor in the corner. For nearly a minute, he did not blink. When the teacher knelt to ask if he was all right, Samuel leaned in as though to whisper, and simply said 51. Then he resumed coloring as if nothing had happened. By Christmas, the Vane home looked like a postcard again, wreath on the door, candles in the windows. Yet people walked past with quickened steps. The house seemed to be listening. Elias no longer stopped to chat on the street. Marjorie began closing the drapes tighter. And Samuel, though seen less often, appeared thinner, the collar of his shirt sitting strangely high on his neck as if to hide something. In the months to come, the Vanes would bring more children into that brick house. But Samuel's arrival was the first drop into water that was far deeper and far darker than anyone in town understood. The winter doctor was a careful man who washed his hands even after shaking a parishioner's glove. Dr. Vernon Hobb came to the Vane house on an afternoon so white with frost that his horse's breath hung like gauze. He was there for a routine examination for Samuel's school admission, a courtesy Elias insisted on with tidy politeness. In the east sitting room, the doctor listened to the boy's lungs and marked good health on the form. Then he asked to see the back of the neck. Marjorie unbuttoned the collar with careful fingers and folded the cloth down. At the base of Samuel's skull, the doctor saw a circle. Not a bruise, not the splash of a common birthmark. A perfect ring the size of a nickel with faint lines drawing inward like spokes. The skin inside was slightly paler, as if heat had pressed there and taught the body a shape. Samuel's shoulders tightened. He stared at the wall and did not move. Dr. Hobb prided himself on steady thought, yet his mind ran. He touched the ring. The skin was cool and oddly numb beneath his fingertip, a numbness that seemed to push back. Samuel did not flinch. The doctor felt or imagined the softest tap beneath the mark, like a second pulse. He withdrew his hand and wrote nothing about it. People in small towns leave certain lines blank to keep the world simple. That night, the doctor sat at his roll-top desk and opened a private ledger for oddities. He drew the circle and wrote, "Distinct round mark at occipital base, not vascular, resembles controlled cautery." He had treated factory burns and crude brandings. He had never seen neatness like this on a child. At school, Samuel kept rules the way other children kept secrets. He copied letters without blotting and returned every borrowed eraser. Yet teachers felt a chill when he bent to read because the back of his neck looked wrong, like the seam of a doll turned outward. During recess, a bigger boy shoved him for refusing a game. Samuel did not strike back. Later, the boy who pushed him went home with a sudden nosebleed that would not stop. The church midwife, Mrs. Talley, came by with quilts and stayed long enough to hear a heavy latch slide somewhere below the parlor. She noticed how Marjorie never slouched, as if a hidden board kept her upright. When asked about the child's sleep, Marjorie smiled and said children dream rough when they feel safe. Later, as the midwife combed Samuel's hair by the window, the boy's reflection lagged by a breath. Mrs. Talley set the comb down and crossed herself. In February, the doctor saw the ring again, not on Samuel, but in a faded photograph a retired teacher brought. The picture was from 1896, taken on the same school steps. In the back row, a boy wore his collar too high for summer. The teacher tapped the photo and said the child had disappeared that autumn, along with 3 others near Birch Lane. The doctor slid the photograph beside his ledger and closed the drawer softly. Samuel's second scream came when the thaw began. It was shorter than the first and ended as if cut by a hand. A milkman at dawn saw Elias carry buckets down the cellar stairs and come up with them empty. In the yard, Samuel stood barefoot in the softening snow, eyes closed, as if listening through the earth to something that kept time. Asked later if his feet were cold, he said he could not feel them. By spring, the town agreed, without saying so, not to ask about the boy's collar or the household's late hours. but the first mark had already altered the house like a nail driven deep into a hidden beam. And Samuel, obedient and small, began to sleep with his head turned just so, keeping the circle away from the pillow as if it needed air. The number he whispered in the church basement felt larger now, less like a child's oddity and more like an address. Neighbors said the hallway sighed on damp nights, sometimes softly. It waited in the room the way a clock waits behind a wall. 2 years passed before the next child came to Birch Lane. In that time, Samuel grew taller but not broader, as if his bones stretched in silence without feeding the flesh. His eyes deepened into something unreadable and his hands stayed cold even in the summer heat. Then on a damp morning in May, a covered carriage rolled up to the Vane home. Out stepped a small girl in a pale blue dress, gripping a cloth bag and blinking at the fog. Her name was Esther. She was 7 from an orphanage in another state, the Vanes said, one that specialized in troubled cases. She had a strange, quiet composure for a child who'd just lost one world and entered another. Marjorie took her hand in a manner that looked tender but was firm enough to guide without choice. From the upstairs window, Samuel watched her arrival without moving, as though he'd been waiting. Within a week, the neighbors began remarking on her mark. The seamstress noticed it while fitting her for a Sunday dress. The same perfect circle at the base of her neck, pale against her skin, precise as a seal pressed into wax. When asked if it hurt, Esther shook her head but pressed her lips shut until the question passed. It was the sleep that unsettled the orphanage matron most, she had told Marjorie at the handover. Each night Esther spoke in her sleep, her voice low and oddly formal, describing the same place. Cold iron under bare feet, steps that go down but never up. The air tastes like pennies. The matron had called it a child's nightmare. In the Vane house, the dreams continued. Only now they came without her even sleeping, her eyes half-lidded as if listening to something deep under the floor. Samuel and Esther rarely spoke directly to each other, but their movements in the house seemed to align, like they were tracing the same invisible path. They avoided certain floorboards, the same ones that creaked too heavily for their size. Sometimes Marjorie would open the pantry and find them both standing in its corner, silent, staring at the wall as though it were a doorway. At school, their teachers began collecting their drawings, puzzled. Samuel showed winding stairs leading to a round chamber with no doors. Esther depicted the same chamber, but with 5 dark shapes in a circle along the walls. Neither child seemed aware that their art matched. The images grew more detailed each week. Cross-hatched shadows, markings on the iron steps, and in one, a small brass chair in the center of the room. Mrs. Talley, the midwife, saw the drawings when she visited with soup after Marjorie claimed both children had the influenza. She asked quietly if the children had ever been to the coast because their pictures resembled the old sea forts she had seen in her youth. Marjorie smiled too long before answering, then carefully stacked the papers and set them in a locked drawer. It was a teacher who raised the alarm first. Miss Alder, who taught handwriting, stopped by the Vane home one rainy Thursday after Esther turned in an assignment in which every letter O was perfectly round and darkened, matching the size of her neck mark exactly. She knocked, was let in, and was not seen at the school the following Monday. The principal claimed she'd taken ill and gone to stay with a sister, but no one could recall her mentioning family. By late summer, the town's curiosity hardened into a kind of shared pretense. People greeted the Vanes on the street, asked about the children, and accepted short answers. Yet those who lingered outside the house after dark spoke of a smell like hot metal drifting from the east wing, and the faint sound of something, or someone, pacing below the floors in long, patient circuits. Samuel and Esther never spoke of their marks to anyone, but in rare moments passing each other on the stairs, their eyes met in a way that made it clear. The mark was not the strangest thing they shared. Something deeper tied them together. Something the house seemed to know and feed. By the winter of 1929, the Vane home had gathered an unspoken reputation. It was a place where children appeared without warning and for a time could be seen in the yard under careful watch before becoming shadows at the windows. When the third child arrived, a boy named Peter, 9 years old, broad-faced and quiet, he stepped through the front gate with the same slow, deliberate walk Samuel and Esther had shown on their first days. His collar was high, even for the bitter season, and his eyes never wandered from Elias's back as they crossed the threshold. Weeks later, a fourth child came, a pale girl named Ruth, 6 years old, her hair so light it seemed silver under the street lamps. She clutched a toy lamb worn down to bear cloth. And then, almost without pause, a fifth, a little boy, Thomas, no more than 5, who looked too small to be carrying the satchel on his shoulder. Each bore the same precise circular mark at the base of the neck, and each within nights of arrival began to cry in their sleep. The dreams, though, were never about monsters or falling. They were about walking, always barefoot, always downward, along cold iron stairs. The air was damp. The sound was metallic, the kind of echo that comes from deep inside a hollow structure. They could never see where the stairs ended, but each said they could smell something ahead, pennies and burnt cloth. None of them told the others about these dreams, yet when Marjorie began separating their bedrooms, placing each on a different floor, the same cries still rang out. Sometimes all at once, sometimes one after another in a sequence that seemed to travel through the house like a signal. It was Ruth who began to draw the place most clearly. Her notebooks filled with dark spirals that widened into a round chamber lined with tall shapes. Peter's schoolwork shifted too. His handwriting suddenly filled with numbers he couldn't explain. 51, 51, 51. Thomas, too young to write, pressed coins into the floorboards beneath his bed, all of them arranged in circles. By late February, the children began avoiding parts of the house. They would not cross the east hallway without holding their breath. They refused to stand near the small square of warped boards beside the pantry. The smallest boy would weep and pull at his hair if forced to walk over the boards, screaming that it was thin there, that you can hear them. One evening, a neighbor delivering eggs noticed the hallway rug had been shifted aside, exposing the warped planks. Elias was kneeling there, tapping each board with the butt of a screwdriver, listening. When he saw her, he smiled as if embarrassed and said he'd heard a mouse. But as she left, she heard the thud of nails being driven in, sharp and fast. In March, the teacher from the one-room schoolhouse wrote a letter to the county board after a day that left her hands shaking. She had been helping Thomas with his letters when Esther, sitting 3 rows back, began humming softly. A deep, even tone, not like a child's song at all. Samuel joined in without looking up from his arithmetic. Then Peter, then Ruth. The sound was low, pulsing, as if they were matching some slow beat only they could hear. Thomas, eyes wide, began humming too, and when it reached its peak, all 5 stopped at once. The silence afterward was so sharp the teacher dropped her chalk. The letter was never answered. The teacher left the county by summer. That spring, a traveling photographer passed through and offered to take family portraits. Elias declined, but allowed the man to photograph the children in the yard. In every frame, no matter where they stood, their shadows bent faintly toward the east hallway wall inside the house, as if leaning to hear something from beneath the floor. By midsummer, the dreams had bled beyond the children. Mrs. Tally, the midwife, confided to her sister that she had begun seeing the iron staircase in her own sleep, and she had never been inside the Vane home. A coalman delivering to the cellar woke one night gasping for breath, swearing he'd been walking downward in the dark for hours, always hearing the faint sound of someone behind him. The house had begun to teach the dreams to anyone who came too close. And like the marks on the children's necks, the dreams were not fading, they were spreading. The storm rolled in low from the river and pressed its damp weight against the Vane house until the brick looked glazed. Telegraph lines sang thin notes, curtains were drawn tight, lamps burned shakily in their chimneys. Elias walked the rooms with his quiet routine, testing latches, checking the furnace door, setting the coal scuttle in its exact place beside the stove. Marjorie arranged cups on saucers without a clink, as if any extra sound might loosen something hidden. The children were sent upstairs early with warm milk and the instruction to keep their shoes lined neatly at the edge of their beds, heels touching the baseboard, toes toward the door. Outside, the wind moved in long, steady runs like a breath the whole town had to share. Near midnight, the east hallway rose. Not a simple creak, not the settling that comes with old houses, but a slow swell that lifted the runner and set it down again, as if a lung had learned it existed beneath the floorboards and wanted to prove it. Samuel stood barefoot in his doorway and watched the rug ripple. He placed his heel on the seam of 2 boards and felt a faint push, an inhale that traveled through bone. He did not call for Elias. He shifted his weight and waited for the exhale, which came with a soft sound like cloth pulled through a ring. Behind him, Esther stood in her own doorway, hands at her sides, eyes heavy and calm, as if she had expected this exact movement all winter. Elias arrived with a hammer and a measured calm that told the children he recognized the rhythm and had already made notes on it in his head. He rolled the runner back and pressed his palm to the seam. The wood was cool and somehow alive under his hand, rising in a pulse he could not predict. He set bright nails at short intervals, 2 exact blows for each. From somewhere below, a delayed knock answered after every strike, proof that the space was deeper than a crawl and as patient as a well. Marjorie stood with a tin of tacks and a folded rag. Her eyes kept to the place where the boards rose most and never once blinked at the sound. The house held still for an hour as if thinking about what to do next. Morning brought a different quiet. Doors paused an inch before the frame and needed a firm hand. A glass left on the dining table drifted the smallest bit toward the east if someone nudged it and looked away. The children felt it in their knees and ankles. Peter said the chair hummed. Esther asked if the house was seasick. Thomas crawled under the pantry table and pressed his ear to the floor, then covered his mouth with both hands, not to keep from talking, but to keep from swallowing, as if swallowing might pull something in. By afternoon, the swell returned with the sky bright and clean, as if weather no longer mattered. Elias drilled small relief holes along the seam with a brace and bit. The shavings rose damp and smelled faintly of pennies. He threaded soft wire through 2 boards and twisted until the edges kissed, a stitched line so neat it looked planned long before the storm. He wiped his hands and wrote a short line in a pocket notebook. The breathing steadied, then waited, then resumed at a count he recorded and did not share. That night Samuel refused food. He sat straight at the table, hands folded, and said evenly that he could not swallow because the stairs were getting closer. Marjorie cracked a boiled egg and placed it before him, then took him by the wrist when he did not lift his fork. The pantry was a narrow rectangle with no window, a wooden chair and a door that latched from the outside. She told him to kneel and keep his back straight. She closed the door and set a kitchen timer that no longer ticked because its spring had been wound past forgiveness years ago. In the darkness, Samuel counted his breaths until he lost the number. And when the boards under his knees warmed once, then cooled, he understood the room below had moved to meet him. Ruth went in next. Marjorie had found her with her mouth close to one of the relief holes, whispering in a tone meant to soothe. Ruth said she was telling the underfloor not to be afraid. Marjorie said fear was disobedience and led her to kneel beside Samuel. Their knees pressed into the boards until numbness turned to heat. Between the house's long inhalations, they both heard a light tap, as if a fingernail had touched glass and then withdrawn. A metal taste hung in the pantry air, thin and exact, like the memory of blood. On the 3rd night, Elias did not sleep. He set a chair in the hallway with the hammer across his knees and the notebook open on his thigh. He wrote times, intervals, the count between rises. When he dozed, his head snapped up at the faintest shift. Once the breathing quickened without cause, 3 short inhales and a long hold that made his own lungs panic. He pressed his ear to the seam and heard only a low hum, the same pitch the children sometimes hummed at school without knowing they were doing it. He made another note, then another, and kept sitting. Neighbors began to comment on the children's thinness and the new way they moved, lighter on their feet like people who had learned to live at the edge of a bluff. Esther's cheeks narrowed. Peter's eyes glassed. Thomas woke with blood on his pillow from chewing the inside of his mouth in sleep. When the pastor's wife brought a pie, Marjorie met her at the door and did not invite her in. From the threshold, the woman noticed the stitched seam in the runner and asked if a pipe had burst. Marjorie said the house had shifted in the storm and would settle if left alone. She kept the pie and closed the door. The pantry latch grew stubborn. It stuck, then released, then stuck again as if the wood wanted more room. Elias shaved the frame with a chisel, but by evening the door swelled once more, knees bruised, backs held straight longer. When Samuel finally stood without permission, it happened because the board under his left knee warmed and then cooled, a single beat that rose into his body like a warning. He did not tell Marjorie. He placed his palm on the wall and waited for the next breath, which did not come. Silence followed like a held note. On a clear morning after the rain, the postman paused at the gate and tilted his head. The house was still. The breathing for the moment had stopped. But the boards remembered the rhythm, and so did the children, who now turned their faces toward the floor when no one had spoken and paused before crossing thresholds. Silence returned, but it was not the old kind. It was the kind held between one breath and the next, when the lungs are empty and the body waits to see if the world will allow another. That pause stretched through the rooms like a promise. Everyone inside understood what it meant. Once a house has learned to breathe, it will ask to be fed. On a wet night, Esther was found barefoot in the garden, lips dark with dew, whispering that her tongue had been touched by iron. She did not cry. She spoke as if naming weather. The iron was cold at first and then not, and it asked her to be quiet. Marjorie wrapped her in a shawl, led her inside, warmed a spoon, cooled it, pressed metal to tongue, and said nothing. The spoon went into a felt-lined drawer, as if it had become a tool with a purpose the house already knew. In the morning, the children were given a rule: no speech before breakfast and no speech after dark. A brass bell with a crack hung by the pantry. Marjorie called it the hush bell. When it sounded, tongues were to press to the roof of the mouth and lungs to work in silence. Samuel obeyed. Ruth tried to hum and met a stare that ended the sound. Thomas whispered to his toy lamb once, and the lamb was set on the high shelf. The house seemed calmer, like snow falling indoors. Elias introduced the still hour. Each child sat at the table with a small coin on the tongue. A hole in the coin held a cotton loop tied behind the neck so it could not fall. They were to keep it steady without biting, spitting, or swallowing. If metal clicked on teeth, the hush bell rang. After a week, the coins were heavier. The taste of pennies and damp cloth filled their mouths. Saliva pooled, jaws ached. Elias marked times in his notebook and checked a neat box when an hour passed without a single sound. On the third week, Marjorie mixed clove oil and alum in a blue glass cup and dipped a linen swab into the bitter liquid. One by one, she pressed the swab under the children's tongues and along the soft edges until taste thinned and speech felt far away. She said it would calm their nerves. The numbness lasted through the afternoon, and when feeling returned, it came in pins. They drank warm milk and kept their mouths closed like patients after a delicate stitch. Speaking hurt in a way that did not show. The pantry became a room for drills. Elias brought in a narrow board with a shallow notch for the chin. Each child knelt and set the chin in place while he buckled a leather strap behind the head, holding the mouth slightly open without allowing words. He called it posture, the first step of good service, and wrote minutes in his book. Some nights he added a second loop under the tongue, fine as a watch band, lifting the muscle just enough to tire it. They learned that fatigue is a leash. Soon the tongue lay down when told. Elias kept a page he titled The Missing Words. Each time a word caused a stumble or a question, he crossed it out of their days. Soon the crossed words were not only hard ones. We, left, help, home. The children learned to step around the empty places those words had made, like skipping loose stones on a path. They carried meaning in their eyes and hands and let their mouths rest. At school, Esther carried a slate and chalk and wrote answers instead of speaking. small, tidy words that grew simpler by the day. Peter's vowels flattened. Samuel shortened prayers to single syllables, then nodded. The youngest made soft animal sounds that were not words at all. Classmates copied the sounds and laughed until the teacher told them to stop. On the walk home, the five kept their lips closed and breathed through their noses like swimmers. By the gate, they were already quiet enough for the hush bell not to matter. Mrs. Tally was called after Thomas choked on a coin. She arrived steady and left unsteady. On the stove, a tray held blue cups, thread spools and brass weights lined like seeds. Marjorie said the boy needed training. The midwife removed the coin with a hook and asked training for what. Elias said order makes children safe. She saw a pale spoon mark at Esther's lip, closed her bag, and told no one. After that, the drills deepened. The house seemed pleased. The East Hall breathed easier. On quiet afternoons, a bell rang under the floor, answering the hush bell above. Children who do not speak are easier to keep. The next visitor carried letters and found more. By the end of that summer, the vain children had learned to move like shadows. Their mouths obeyed, their knees remembered the boards, and the hush bell ruled their hours. Yet it was the ledger that began to shape the house's next rhythm, a book that was not meant for ink alone but for bone memory and the unseen patterns beneath the floor. Elias discovered it while measuring the pantry beams one late evening, a thin leather-bound volume wedged in the narrow space between the floor joists and the cellar wall. Its cover was cracked, its spine folded at a peculiar angle, as if it had been dropped in haste and then left to settle. The first page held nothing but a square ruled in pencil, subdivided into minuscule boxes. Each box contained a number, sometimes 2 digits, sometimes 3, and a tiny symbol resembling a crescent claw. Marjorie looked over Elias's shoulder and nodded once, as if acknowledging a language she had known all her life. He traced the numbers with his finger and realized the ledger followed a pulse, the same slow rhythm the boards beneath the east hallway had learned. Inhale, exhale, hold. The children were instructed to kneel on mats around the ledger while Elias read from it in silence. Every number, every clawed mark corresponded to a step, a breath, a pause. Samuel was first to notice the effect. When the digits were read aloud silently, tongue pressed to the roof of his mouth, ears straining for rhythm, the floor under the pantry table moved in ways that suggested a cavity larger than any cellar should contain. Esther traced her finger along the symbols while Thomas held the ledger upright. Their actions alone did not explain the response. The house seemed to answer to the thought, the concentration, the collective stillness. The boards rose, settled and swelled in time with each symbol. The ledger became a ritual. Every evening the children knelt in a circle around the floorboards, hands pressed flat, palms warm. Elias read sequences from the book, numbers and clawed crescents that seemed at once arbitrary and precise. Marjorie timed each reading with a small metronome that clicked invisibly in the corner. The house breathed in tandem, its secret lungs measured in fractions, inches, and faint vibrations. A week passed before any visitor could enter the hallway without shivering. Peter began marking new sequences in the margins with pencil, small arrows, loops, and lines connecting numbers. He whispered to no one that it made sense, that the ledger was not just a record but a map. Ruth added to it with charcoal, smudging symbols into shaded spirals that followed the pulse. Their creations were studied silently by Elias, who nodded at the patterns as though they were keys. Even Thomas, barely able to hold a pencil, pressed marks in shorthand, dots and dashes in rhythm with the board's slow rise. Soon the ledger guided actions beyond the house. Marjorie would place small objects, spoons, coins, thread spools, along the seams of the floorboards in patterns dictated by the ledger. The objects shifted slightly each night, realigning without hands, leaving faint impressions in dust and floor polish. The children felt the changes in their knees, the pull of the wood, the tug of something below that neither welcomed nor resisted. It was no longer a ledger of rules, it was a ledger of control, and the house itself seemed to respect it. Neighbors noticed that the children became harder to read, the sound of their steps lighter, the pauses longer. Visitors commented on the stillness in the hallways, on the lack of laughter or conversation. The postman left letters at the gate, and the wind carried the faintest hum from the house when no one opened the door. The ledger, invisible to most, orchestrated the living space, dictating which corners breathed, which doors held tight, which floorboards inhaled and exhaled under the weight of the children's knees. By October, Elias marked a new notation. Ledger complete for this season, rhythm maintained, compliance observed. The ledger itself seemed satisfied. The children knew it had achieved something they could not name, a connection between their actions, their silence, and the hidden pulse beneath the house. The east hallway swelled in pride or expectation, a lung beneath the boards that required nothing but attention and devotion. Every night as they knelt around the ledger, they felt the house's slow approval, a living rhythm that would follow them for years to come. No one outside the house knew the ledger existed. No one would enter the east hallway without its guidance. And in that secrecy, the children learned a new lesson. The power of the house lay not in what could be seen, but in what could be felt. A living ledger of obedience, silence, and unspoken knowledge. By mid-autumn, whispers of the Vane house had begun to drift through the small town like smoke through a chimney. Visitors were few, but when they came, they noticed subtle anomalies. A pause in the wind at the gate, the faintest tremor beneath the floor, or the sound of a child inhaling where no breath seemed necessary. Dr. Harriet Penrose, a local physician and occasional correspondent with the county, was first to record these anomalies in a notebook that would later be found tucked beneath the pantry floorboards. She arrived with polite concern, summoned under the pretense of checking on Ruth's chronic cough. Inside, the house appeared ordinary at first glance. Polished wood, hanging lamps, the smell of boiling herbs and roasted grain. The children greeted her in silence, lips pressed together, eyes wide, hands folded. She noted their stillness with an uncomfortable fascination, as if watching statues practice restraint. Marjorie stood nearby, hands clasped, guiding small gestures with the precision of a conductor leading an orchestra. Every movement was rehearsed, measured, and unnervingly intentional. Elias ushered Dr. Penrose toward the east hallway. The doctor noted a faint vibration underfoot, an irregularity in the wooden floor that seemed almost conscious. "It's just old beams," Elias explained softly, voice calm as water over stone. "They respond to weight." But Harriet felt it differently, a pulse, a deliberate rhythm that mirrored the children's hushed movements. She crouched slightly, listening, and the floor seemed to shift in response, tiny groans and creaks marking her hesitation. Over the next few visits, Harriet tried to engage the children in conversation. She asked simple questions, encouraged responses, and suggested games. None of her efforts succeeded. Words were swallowed before they left the lips. Sometimes she caught a whisper in the corner of a room, a sound more like wind or water, a single syllable that vanished if she tried to trace it. She began to note patterns. A slight tremor in the floorboards, a stutter in the shadows, a hushed echo that was almost a heartbeat. The house was listening, and it seemed to answer. One afternoon, while Elias and Marjorie tended to small household chores, Harriet sat in the dining room. The ledger lay closed on the pantry shelf, the children kneeling in a circle as usual. She saw Samuel move his hand in a subtle pattern, tracing the air above the boards, and immediately the floor beneath him shifted in a slow, undetectable wave. She jotted notes frantically, unable to understand whether this was superstition, training, or something more. The ledger's sequences, she realized, were controlling the very fabric of the house. Visitors continued to arrive over the following weeks. A tax collector, a school inspector, an itinerant scholar from the city. Each noticed the house's rhythm. Each felt its subtle insistence on silence. Some left unnerved, reporting only that the children were peculiarly quiet, or that the floors seemed to breathe underfoot. None saw the ledger. None understood the mechanism. Still, the house maintained its secrecy, preserving the methodical obedience and the unnatural pulse that connected its occupants. One evening, Dr. Penrose lingered too long in the east hallway. She reached for the ledger, curiosity overpowering caution, and immediately felt a sharp vibration beneath her fingers. A sequence had been broken. Elias entered silently, eyes narrowing, and Marjorie's hands hovered near the hush bell. Harriet froze. The ledger's power was tangible, and her intrusion disturbed. The children's knees trembled slightly. The floor beneath them responded with a small, controlled shudder, as if to correct the imbalance. Harriet stepped back, realizing the house itself enforced discipline, and that the ledger's influence extended beyond instruction into something almost alive. Visitors began to leave with small, inexplicable fears lodged in their minds, a sense that silence was more than absence, that obedience was not voluntary, and that the children, while innocent in appearance, were conduits for something far more sinister. The veins themselves said nothing, allowing the house and its ledger to communicate through rhythm, breath, and small, precise movements. Outsiders could listen, but they could not understand. They were intruders in a system older, stricter, and far more deliberate than any social expectation. By late autumn, the house had become a machine of quiet observation. The visitors who listened were never quite the same. Some left unsettled, recording strange dreams, faint auditory hallucinations, and a lingering sense of being watched by something both present and absent. And the children continued their kneeling, their tracing of sequences in the air, their obedience to a ledger that had become both guide and guardian. The pulse beneath the floor was steady, a rhythm no visitor could alter. A reminder that in this house, silence was the language of power. By the turning of the year, the 5 children were no longer ordinary in any recognizable sense. The quiet obedience instilled by coins, swabs, straps, and ledger sequences had begun to carve something deeper into their beings, something visible in gestures, posture, and the faint marks beneath their collars. Each bore a small crescent-shaped birthmark on the left wrist, now more pronounced after weeks of exposure to the hush bell, the tongue drills, and the ledger's rhythms. What had been a pale imprint at birth had darkened, spreading subtly into the shape of a claw that followed the bone beneath the skin. Esther was first to awaken to the change. She noticed it while pressing the ledger's symbols in the east hallway, her fingers tracing sequences that had once required strict guidance but now responded instinctively. When she flexed her hand, the mark seemed to pulse beneath her skin as if aligning with the floorboards themselves. Her lips remained closed, but her eyes, wide and steady, conveyed thought as sharp as any spoken word. Samuel observed her, noticing the subtle light behind her eyes, and felt it rise in himself, a quiet awakening that made him shiver. The awakening was not immediate for all. Ruth began to hum a note, low and near imperceptible, while kneeling in the circle. The sound resonated through the floorboards, and suddenly the ledger's symbols on paper glowed faintly under the dim light, as if acknowledging the vibration. The hush bell rang, soft and corrective, yet Ruth did not flinch. She had learned to feel rhythm in the body and the house, and her humming became a form of communication, one that no visitor could interpret. Thomas mirrored her silently, tracing imaginary symbols in the air above the boards, as if conducting some invisible orchestra. Peter, who had been the quietest, showed the most disturbing change. His fingers began to make intricate patterns, drawing invisible arcs that shifted the boards beneath him in subtle but unmistakable ways. Dust rose from the seams without wind. Objects moved slightly when he passed his hands over them. Elias watched with satisfaction, noting in his journal, Peter reaches the intermediate sequence, response time, 0.5 seconds, floor alignment, optimal. The house's pulse, once merely responsive, now followed the children's initiative, bending to their focus and movement. Marjorie observed the marks with clinical detachment. She dipped a small brush in clove oil and traced the crescents lightly, whispering that the ink would not darken if the children obeyed. Each mark seemed to react to her touch, fading slightly with compliance, deepening when curiosity or fear arose. She taught the children to control their marks consciously, aligning them with the ledger's sequences to harmonize their own energy with the house's rhythm. The process was slow, intimate, and psychologically exacting. Outside the walls, visitors began to notice changes in the children, though none could describe it accurately. Dr. Penrose remarked on their unnatural stillness, the precision in their steps, and the eerie synchronicity of their movements. The school inspector wrote that their behavior was beyond ordinary discipline and almost unnatural, though he could not specify why. Elias dismissed these observations with a serene smile. The children were simply learning, as he had always known, the language of the house and the ledger. As the weeks progressed, the awakening deepened. The children began to share thoughts without speech, understanding the ledger's sequences instinctively and responding in tandem. If one traced a symbol in the air, the others moved in unison, their bodies and the floorboards forming a silent living equation. Sleep brought dreams where sequences shifted themselves, Marks glowed under skin and the house expanded beyond its walls, reaching into the rhythm of the town's streets. One evening, as the candlelight flickered over the ledger, Esther touched her wrist and whispered nothing, feeling the pulse beneath the skin and floorboards align perfectly. Samuel, Ruth, Peter, and Thomas followed instinctively. The marks throbbed with a life of their own, a signal to the house, the ledger, and perhaps to something beyond both. They were no longer merely children. They had become conduits, living sequences, silent instruments of methodical, precise, and unspoken power. Elias noted their transformation in his journal. Marked ones awaken. Sequence achieved. Observers unaware. Potential. Limitless. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters, and even the visitors who listened could feel it. The shift in the house, the subtle dominance of children no longer innocent, the quiet horror of what obedience had wrought. The awakening was complete. Late one night, a fire broke out in the elm trees that lined the far side of the Vane estate. The flames were sudden, unnatural in their speed and heat, and the neighbors' screams carried across the fields. Yet inside the house, the children barely stirred. Their awakening had taught them to measure chaos, to move in rhythm with sequences larger than themselves, and to remain still until it was necessary to act. Elias, hearing the faint crackle of distant flames, approached the east hallway and felt the pulse of the floorboards quicken, as if the ledger itself was aware of the disturbance. Marjorie was first to react. She gathered the children into the hall, instructing them to kneel and trace the sequences in the air above the floor. Their crescents throbbed faintly beneath their skin, marks that had once been simple birthrights now glowing with an almost sentient intelligence. The ledger lay open on the shelf, pages rustling, though no wind entered the house. Elias's hand hovered over it, reading numbers in clawed crescents aloud, each syllable precise, each pause deliberate. The floorboard shifted, expanded, and contracted in rhythm, creating a barrier that the fire could not cross. The children's marks resonated with the ledger's instructions, and the house seemed to breathe fire back, pushing it outward with invisible walls of heat and pressure. Outside, the fire consumed elm and underbrush, sending sparks and smoke into the night sky. Neighbors ran shouting, attempting to douse the flames with buckets and hoses, but the fire behaved strangely. It burned in patches, retreating when it reached a certain line, moving around invisible boundaries, leaving untouched sections in its path. Witnesses swore that the house itself seemed to control the fire, bending it to an impossible design that no wind or human hand could explain. Inside, the children moved with terrifying precision. Thomas traced symbols rapidly above the floorboards, while Peter's hands guided unseen arcs of energy that seemed to hold walls in place and redirect the heat away from the windows. Ruth hummed low, a note that penetrated the ledger's sequences, reinforcing the rhythm, and Esther's crescents glowed brighter, marking the alignment of body, house, and ledger. Elias and Marjorie observed quietly, hands folded, eyes calculating, faces calm as if they had seen this pattern before. For the first time, the neighbors peered through the windows and noticed the unnatural stillness of the Vane estate. The children, though kneeling, radiated control. The flames, once wild, now danced around invisible borders confined to the elm grove, unable to touch the house. Smoke curled in impossible, patterns, sometimes vanishing entirely, sometimes forming shapes that resembled claws or crescents before dissipating. The ledger had become more than a book. It was a conductor, a barrier, and a weapon of methodical, disciplined control. Elias finally gave the silent command. The children rose, moving with the rhythm they had internalized. The fire seemed to shrink, the heat pushed back as if guided by invisible hands. The neighbors, still outside, could not comprehend what they saw. It was not magic nor coincidence. It was the ledger's power manifested through the children, marks glowing, pulses synchronized, and the house alive with intent. The aftermath was quiet. By dawn, the elm grove was charred, yet the house stood untouched and still. The children returned to their usual positions, kneeling in a circle, crescents, faint once more beneath their skin. Traces of awakening retained, but subdued. Elias closed the ledger and replaced it on the shelf, noting the sequences in a journal. Fire sequence successful. Sequence maintained. Observers unaware of the full mechanism. Children are stable. Marjorie nodded once, eyes scanning the room, confirming that no rhythm had been broken, that the pulse of the house remained constant. The neighbors would later tell stories of the night, speaking in hushed tones of a fire that obeyed a will not human, flames that moved in impossible patterns, and children who seemed older than their years, orchestrating chaos with silence and precision. None could enter the house to confirm, none would see the ledger. And inside, the children learned something that night more deeply than any other lesson. The ledger and the house were extensions of themselves, and their control, once awakened, was absolute. Yet the experience left a mark. Even the children, trained in obedience, felt the weight of power. Samuel pressed his wrist to his side, feeling the faint throb of his crescent, realizing for the first time the responsibility, or the curse, that came with mastery. The house had not only protected itself but demonstrated the terrifying potential of what the ledger and they could command. The Vane estate, silent once more, held within its walls the knowledge that outside forces could threaten, but only within the rules the ledger dictated could any chaos be controlled. And as the dawn broke over the charred elm court, the children knelt silently, waiting for the next sequence, the next pulse, the next lesson that would deepen the methodical, precise, and horrifying mastery that would define them forever. By the following spring, the quiet grip of the Vane household had shifted from control to reflection. Elias, ever methodical, began cataloging every detail of the ledger's sequences, cross-referencing behaviors, movements, and the subtle reactions of the children. Marjorie, equally precise, started burying letters and confessions in the hollowed trunk of an oak near the north wing, each missive detailing small transgressions, observations, and compliance reports of the children. These were not diaries in the ordinary sense. They were records of obedience, records of ritual, and accounts of acts so precise and methodical that only a mind attuned to cruelty could see their full weight. The children, their crescents faint but alive beneath their skin, moved through the household in near silence. They were aware, almost instinctively, that their actions were being recorded, evaluated, and weighed against some invisible standard. Ruth traced her fingers lightly over the floorboards, feeling the pulse of the house and ledger as she rehearsed movements that she had performed countless times. Samuel followed suit, noting the faint quiver in the air as the sequences aligned. Peter and Thomas mirrored each other, their crescents glowing in faint rhythm to the ledger's commands, and Esther oversaw minor discrepancies, correcting errors without prompting, the precision of their ritual absolute. Elias wrote with a calm detachment. Each confession buried in the oak carried instructions, outcomes, and evaluations of the children's obedience. The entries were not merely factual. They were psychological experiments cataloging fear, patience, focus, and response. In one note, Elias detailed a small test he had performed with Peter, leaving a candle burning near the pantry door and observing the child's reaction. Peter's eyes had widened imperceptibly, fingers twitching. But he had not moved until signaled by the ledger's sequence. Elias recorded every fraction of a second, every tremor, noting that Peter's restraint under potential danger was optimal with minimal deviation. Marjorie, meanwhile, ensured that the oak's hollow concealed the confessions from any casual observer. Each letter was placed carefully, lined in overlapping sequences like a ledger itself, forming a concealed archive of observation and methodical cruelty. The entries described punishments meted out with scientific rigor. Tongues pressed to cold metal to correct hesitation, hands bound in silent drills to align with ledger sequences, or minor burns delivered with heated oil on coin edges. The pain measured but contained, never breaking the rhythm. The children endured each test with obedience that bordered on the uncanny, crescents faintly glowing as if acknowledging both punishment and reward. In one particularly harrowing entry, Elias recounted the mirror sequence. The children were placed before a polished panel of glass in a dimly lit room. Each had to maintain eye contact with their reflection while performing the sequence of gestures dictated by the ledger. Any hesitation, misalignment, or blink was noted, followed by corrective measures that left small scars. Pinpricks on the skin, slight abrasions on palms, marks that faded yet lingered as psychological reminders. The children endured it, eyes steady, crescents alive, minds learning to separate pain from compliance, fear from control. Visitors remained unaware. Dr. Penrose, who occasionally returned, noticed only that the children were unnaturally still, that their crescents sometimes glimmered faintly beneath sleeves, and that the house itself seemed attuned to unseen rhythms. No one questioned the ledger or the oak. The confessions, buried in secrecy, held truths darker than any observer could imagine, detailing methodical cruelty disguised as learning and obedience. By mid-spring, a subtle tension filled the air. The children, while perfectly aligned with the ledger, began to show faint signs of emotional burden. Samuel's shoulders tensed after long sequences. Esther's eyes sometimes flickered toward the oak as if sensing the weight of past records. And Ruth hummed lower notes, perhaps absorbing the echoes of pain recorded in Marjorie's buried confessions. Peter and Thomas moved with absolute precision, yet their crescents pulsed in a rhythm that suggested awareness beyond instruction, a consciousness of their own capacity trained and measured. Elias and Marjorie watched silently, understanding the consequences of their methods. The ledger, the crescents, the confessions, together they formed a system of absolute methodical control, a psychological architecture that was cruel and precise. Yet even they noted the subtleties. The children were changing, evolving into conduits of obedience that bordered on inhuman. The ritualized cruelty, once external, had begun to internalize, shaping not only behavior but mind and soul. By the final entries in the oak, Elias wrote, "Children fully aligned, sequence perfected, marks deepening. Observers are ignorant. Control is complete, yet responsibility weighs. Future sequence requires monitoring. Potential for deviation exists only in emotion, which must be tempered." Marjorie added, "Confessions sealed. Archive buried. The house continues its pulse. Children aware, yet unknowing of full measure. System complete, silent. The future may bear witness, yet none may interpret." The confessions buried in oak remained undiscovered, a silent testament to methodical cruelty and ritualized obedience. They chronicled a dark experimentation in human behavior, one that merged ritual, punishment, and learning into a system that few minds could comprehend. And in the quiet of the vain estate, the children continued to kneel, crescents faintly glowing, rhythms precise, forever carrying the burden of confessions unseen, lessons unspoken, and a legacy of cruelty methodical and absolute. The final months at the vain estate arrived with the weight of inevitability. The children, now fully marked and fully awakened, moved with a precision that blurred the line between obedience and instinct. Every gesture, every pulse of their crescents beneath skin resonated with the ledger's command. Elias walked the hallways with calm detachment, observing as Samuel traced sequences across the floorboards, Ruth's humming intertwining with invisible energies, and Peter and Thomas orchestrating arcs that no visitor could perceive. Esther, ever vigilant, adjusted and corrected, ensuring alignment with sequences that had become more exacting, more subtle, and more impossible to measure. Marjorie remained in the shadows, her eyes following movements with surgical scrutiny. She added small notations to the ledger, updating sequences and rules, marking minor deviations and improvements. The house itself seemed to breathe with them, pulses of floorboards and walls vibrating to the rhythm of crescents, ledger, and body, a quiet symphony of controlled energy. Outside, the world remained unaware. The estate a silent theater of methodical mastery, hidden behind the veneer of normalcy and children's innocence. The ledger, now worn and stained from years of use, contained every ritual, every sequence, every act of discipline and obedience. Its pages whispered of minor torments and deliberate tests. Tongues pressed to cold metal edges, hands held under running water while sequences were performed, minor burns traced precisely to align pain with rhythm. Yet every act had a method, every punishment a purpose, every sequence an aim. The children had internalized this rhythm, no longer needing prompts. The ledger had become an extension of their very consciousness. Elias prepared a final alignment sequence, one that would test not only obedience but total synchronization with the ledger and house. He instructed the children to kneel in the great hall, crescents glowing faintly, eyes steady and hands tracing the invisible patterns in the air. Each movement, each pulse resonated with precision. The house responded, floorboards shifted subtly, walls vibrated in harmony, and the air itself seemed to hum with energy. The children were no longer learning. They were conduits, living instruments of a system perfected over years of methodical control. Marjorie read aloud the ledger's final instructions. The words were simple yet exacting, directing posture, alignment, breathing, and focus. Any deviation would be noted, any hesitation catalogued for future correction. As the sequence unfolded, the crescents pulsed brighter, marking full alignment. The children moved as one, an organism of rhythm and pulse, their individuality absorbed into the greater pattern. Observers, the observers, should they have been present, would have seen 5 children kneeling quietly. Those aware of the ledger's power would have recognized a force nearly inhuman, a consciousness operating across body, mind, and environment. After hours of synchronized sequences, Elias recorded his final observations. The children's crescents were fully awakened, their understanding and control complete. Every sequence could be repeated flawlessly, every ritual executed without deviation, every pulse of the house mirrored by their own. They had become more than children. They were living embodiments of methodical, ritualized, and absolute control. Their awakening was no longer private. It existed in perfect silence, unspoken yet complete. The fire in the elm court, the confessions buried in oak, and the years of meticulous observation had prepared them for this moment. The ledger's last rhythm was a culmination, a final proof of control over body, mind, and environment. Elias and Marjorie, satisfied, allowed themselves a rare moment of pause, observing the children kneeling in perfect harmony. The crescents glowed faintly, a heartbeat visible beneath the skin, a sign that the rhythm lived on, internalized and eternal. Beyond the estate, society eventually began to respond to fragments of the vain legacy. Scholars discovered odd journals and letters, fragments of the oak confessions that had been unearthed decades later. Laws regarding the observation and treatment of children, the use of psychological control, and institutional oversight were revised in response. Memorials were built in towns that had suffered indirect effects, commemorating those who had endured unexplained fear, unobserved cruelty, and silent influence. Yet the children themselves remained hidden, their crescents faded in memory but present in essence, a quiet testimony to what methodical evil could accomplish when unnoticed. The philosophical reflection was unavoidable. Evil, Elias had shown, operates best in silence. It is neither loud nor obvious. It is subtle, precise, and patient. The ledger, the crescents, the rituals, all demonstrated that cruelty need not be overt to be devastating. Its legacy was measured not in headlines, not in confessions made public, but in the shaping of minds, the rhythm of obedience, and the internalization of discipline and fear. Those who look for evil in dramatic forms may miss the quiet sequences, the hidden crescents, and the careful alignment that ensures its survival across generations. In the final scene, the children stood, crescents faint but steady, aligning with the house, the ledger, and the invisible rhythm that governed them. Their faces bore no expression, yet each pulse beneath the skin marked a consciousness awake to the power they had absorbed. Elias closed the ledger one last time. Marjorie nodded, and the house exhaled quietly, its pulse in harmony with the children and the sequences perfected over years of methodical practice. The story ends with a question left to the viewer. What is the measure of silent evil? Could such precision, such patient cruelty occur again in another hidden corner, another house, another mind attuned to rhythm and obedience? The crescents, faint and unseen by the world, pulse on. What do you think? Could this happen again? Years after the Vane estate fell silent, the echoes of what occurred within its walls began to surface, subtle at first, then undeniable. Letters unearthed from the oak revealed the confessions, sequences, and observations that had governed 5 children's lives, their crescents faintly noted in margins, their responses catalogued in methodical detail. Scholars and authorities who examined the documents understood immediately that this was not mere cruelty. It was a system, a mind refined for control, a quiet orchestration of obedience and fear. The public, initially horrified, gradually came to grasp the scale of what had been hidden behind domestic normalcy, the breadth of evil masked by routine and silence. Legislation was influenced directly. Laws surrounding child welfare, institutional oversight, and psychological supervision were rewritten. Specific clauses were added to prevent isolated households from exercising unchecked control over minors, and protocols for reporting and investigating unusual behavior. Symbolic markings or signs of ritualized influence were codified. Experts debated whether such laws could ever fully prevent methodical cruelty like that practiced in the Vane estate. Recognizing that true evil often operates where observation is weakest and patience is longest. The children themselves, though long removed from the estate, were never interviewed publicly. They remained living symbols of obedience internalized, their crescents invisible to society yet eternal in their psyche. Memorials were constructed in towns that had unwittingly interacted with the Vanes, places where unexplained disappearances, sudden illnesses, or behavioral anomalies had quietly occurred. Each memorial carried a subtle warning, a reminder that cruelty can thrive without spectacle. Plaques told only fragments. That children had endured unseen tests, that a family once cloaked in normalcy had hidden meticulous cruelty, and that remembrance was necessary to prevent recurrence. Communities began small-scale educational programs, teaching the signs of psychological manipulation, subtle coercion, and ritualized influence. Knowledge that had once been invisible to even the most attentive eyes. Psychologists and historians studied the Vane records in tandem, fascinated by the ledger's precision and the crescent's symbolic function. They concluded that the children's experiences had created a model of extreme obedience and internalized control, one that could be reproduced only by combining intellectual rigor with emotional suppression and environmental influence. This knowledge carried a chilling lesson. Methodical evil does not rely on force alone. It relies on patience, ritual, and the human mind's susceptibility to subtle, repeated patterns. In this reflection, society glimpsed the quiet terror of a system that could shape thought and action without overt threat. Culturally, the story inspired documentaries, novels, and faceless narrations that explored hidden cruelty. Each retelling emphasized not the spectacle of punishment but the psychological architecture behind it, inviting viewers to confront the idea that evil often thrives in silence, in rhythm, in repetition, where no one is watching, and where every small gesture is observed and catalogued. The crescents became symbolic, a faint motif representing the unseen pressures and the quiet shaping of human behavior, a reminder that innocence can mask both observance and endurance. Philosophically, the Vane legacy challenged assumptions about morality and vigilance. Scholars pondered whether evil is a force in itself or merely the patience and precision of one mind over others. The children's crescents, their obedience, and their internalized lessons proved that cruelty need not be visible to be effective. It need only be consistent, measured, and hidden. The lesson was grim. Systems of influence, when maintained quietly and methodically, could endure far longer than outrage, far longer than punishment. Silence was the most effective shield and patience the most dangerous weapon. In the final narration, viewers were invited to reflect not only on the historical events but on their own awareness of subtle coercion in everyday life, the power of repetition, the quiet weight of authority, the systems that shape behavior without notice. The story closed not with resolution but with contemplation, leaving the crescents faintly glowing in memory, the sequences perfected in thought, and the ledger forever closed but understood. And so, we ask again, could this happen again? Are the systems around us enough to prevent quiet cruelty from taking root? Watch carefully, observe the rhythms, and remember, evil often walks in silence.